When you think of tube amps, what springs to mind? For most people, it conjures thoughts of rich, smooth vocals and a silky, maybe slightly rolled off top end. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. Tubes can be a daunting proposition for anybody first entering that world, because there's just so many variables to consider. Suddenly, the amp that you thought you were buying could become more resolving, less resolving, warmer, cooler, bigger soundstage, smaller soundstage. The many permutations can be dizzying. Well, the good news is that any decent tube amp with any decent tubes is never going to sound bad. The even better news is that if you choose carefully, tubes can be the very best way to get your system sounding exactly how you want it. For example, if you love the idea of creamy, rich vocals, then you might want to run a set of KT66s or EL34s. Maybe you've already got an amp that can run those, maybe you're trying to work out which amplifier to buy. If you prefer a more dynamic, punchy and crisp sound, you might lean more towards a KT88. I have some EL34 and some KT88 tubes to talk about today, and so there are two things you can take from this video. If you have an amp that can run one or both of these tube varieties, then you can work out if either of these new tube offerings is a good option for you. And if you don't currently own a tube amp that's running one of these tubes, you can see what I have to say about them and decide if you want to go and get yourself a tube amp specifically to run one of these varieties. Let's go, shall we? I have a heavily upgraded Elekit TU8200R headphone amp and speaker amp, and it runs all kinds of tubes including 6L6s, EL34s, KT88s, KT66s, and I've previously enjoyed it with some pretty rich, creamy sounding tubes like the Mallard EL34, that's a new production tube, but I've also got some legendary new old stock or NOS GEC KT66 tubes, and also some NOS Shugwang KT88 Black Treasure tubes. Those are all tubes that I bought myself to explore the different options that they would deliver and see what I like the most. These Ray tubes though are a little bit different. I sell these tubes here in Australia, and so I'm not going to call this a review because I can't be completely unbiased. What I can do though is tell you how each of these sounds in the Elekit TU8200R compared to those other tubes I just mentioned, and help you understand how each of these sounds and then let you work out the rest. So let's start with the Ray Tube's EL34 Select. EL34 tubes in general are a great tube if you like a richer, warmer sounding mid-range. But like with any tube variant, the specific degrees of richness, smoothness, detail, clarity, soundstage, all those things will vary depending on the exact brand and even within the brand, which level of the tube you're buying. The new production Mallard tubes that I have here go for about 140 Australian dollars a pair, and that means they're about 80 to 90 US dollars for a pair, and we're talking matched pairs here. In contrast, the Ray Tube's EL34 Select tubes come in at 215 Australian dollars or about 140 US dollars, again for a matched pair. Of course, you can buy these as singles or quads if you need to, but I'm talking mostly about matched pairs here. Comparing the two EL34 variants and listening to Probably, there's a massive increase in separation and soundstage size going from the Mallards up to the Ray Select tubes. You'd expect that for the price, but it was encouraging to hear nonetheless. With the Ray tubes, the vocal is clearly separated from the mix, so you can focus on it if you want to. It doesn't get lost in amongst the rest of the instruments. And in fact, it's fair to say that some might find the EL34 Select tubes to be a little bit lean compared to what you might be used to from a richer, smoother EL34. If you're looking for a super thick, creamy EL34 presentation, the Ray Select tube might not be right for you. But I definitely prefer it over the Mallards because it balances richness and clarity, which I really enjoy. For example, when there sounds like finger clicks in the music, the EL34 Select tubes deliver a better sense of the attack and the energy and the clarity around the finger clicks, whereas it's a little bit mushy from the Mallards. I love the Mallards for their vocal quality, but they do lack a little bit of that energy and sparkle that is needed sometimes. The Rays also produce bass that's tight and clean, and so really from top to bottom, they're just a more resolving, more technically capable tube than what I can hear from the Mallards. In short, I think the EL34 Select tube delivers a balance of richness, clarity, and technical performance that I haven't really heard from cheaper EL34 tubes. However, if you want the very, very best in a creamy, rich, but detailed tube, it's impossible to not consider the NOS GEC KT66 tubes, if you can afford them. These regularly go for anywhere between $300 to even about $900 or more per matched pair, and with good reason. The degree of nuance and character that these tubes deliver is nothing short of exceptional. They're unmatched for their tone, their nuance, and their detail, but still smoothness from any other tube I've tried, except maybe the Ray Select 6S and 7 Reserve tubes, but they're different tubes that are running in different amps, so I can't directly compare them. So I was really curious to see just how close the EL34 Select could get to the NOS JEC KT66. Comparing the EL34 and the KT66 shows that the KT66 is still the king of the glorious, smooth, rich and nuanced mid-range. It could be too much for some, but I think the smoothness and richness is wonderfully balanced with detail and clarity and nuance. It's still to me one of the very best tubes I've ever tried. But it's not as one-sided as I expected. The EL34 delivers a wider soundstage than the KT66, and that helps to improve the sense of separation, but at the expense of a little bit of sense of focus and clarity in the center image. But we're talking only a little shift here. I actually wouldn't say that either is better or worse, they're just different. For those that prefer width in the soundstage, you're going to be very happy with the EL34. For those that prefer focus and intimacy in the soundstage but with good separation, you're going to prefer the KT66. There are also some differences in the bass presentation, where the EL34 Select tube is a bit tighter, a bit snappier and punchier, while the KT66 has a little bit more sense of bloom to the sound. It's a little bit slower and a little bit fuller sounding. Again, that's one of those things that's neither better or worse, they're just different, and it's going to come down to your preferences. I'd say the overall sense of clarity across the entire frequency range is a wash. The KT66 brings out a bit more nuance and detail through the mid-range. The EL34 brings out a greater sense of clarity and resolution in the top end. And so if we consider the preferential qualities of sound, and we factor in things like a 12-month warranty, availability, consistent pricing of the EL34s, suddenly the EL34 looks like a really good option for those wanting a vocal and mid-range focused tube. It's still got good technical capabilities, good staging capabilities, and for some people it's going to be preferable to the KT66 because it's not quite as rich and creamy through the mids. But what if you're not after a mid-range focused tube? What if you're all about dynamics and energy and punch and rhythm in your sound? You'd be forgiven for thinking that that's not the realm of tubes and that that's all about solid state gear. You'd be forgiven, that is, if you've never heard a tube amp running KT88s. These tubes are always energetic and dynamic, sometimes actually too much for me. I didn't care much for the Genelex Gold Line KT88s that I originally bought for my TU-8200R amp because I found that they flattened the soundstage and they lacked nuance. It was all in your face, full dynamics, full bore. It was like everything was turned up to 11.
11? Look, right across the board. 11, 11,
and most of
11,
the
and
amps go up to 10.
The NOS Shugwang KT88 Black Treasures that I picked up were definitely better, but they were still easily displaced by the glorious GEC KT66s that I've just been talking about. When I first opened up the packet of the Ray Tubes KT88 Selects, I didn't actually expect too much. And I was actually surprised to find that they're less in your face than other KT88 tubes. That might be good for some, maybe not so much for others. These KT8s delivered a more nuanced sound, a spacious sound, but one that still had clarity and energy to it. It's just that clarity and energy wasn't all that it offered. In fact, I went from never using KT88s in the TU-8200R to now only using KT88s in the TU-8200R. These KT88 tubes have displaced the GEC KT66s, and therefore I can say that I also prefer them over the Shugwang Black Treasures and also over the Ray Tubes EL34 Select tubes. Going back to the Black Treasures for a moment, they're still a lovely tube, very crisp and very clean, but they can sometimes push the vocals just a little bit too far back in the mix. They produce an almost slightly V-shaped sound that makes mid-range a little bit secondary. They're not a bassy tube as such, but they are punchy and dynamic down low. They also separate everything really well from left to right, but they don't produce a great sense of depth in the soundstage. In other words, they're a great example and probably one of the best examples I've heard of what I'd call the quintessential KT88 sound. The Ray KT88 Selects are different. They're sort of like a typical KT88, and they're sort of not. The KT88 Select delivers a smoother sound that's less crispy and a bit fuller bodied than most other KT88s that I've heard. They don't create quite as much width in the soundstage, but they produce a slightly greater sense of depth in the soundstage and overall produce what I consider to be a more natural image as a result. The KT88 Select is actually more like the GEC KT66 than it is like the Black Treasure KT88s, but they're also still crisper and more dynamic than the KT66s. Hopefully I haven't lost you here. And so if you love a dynamic and in-your-face tube like the Genelex Goldline KT88s, these might not be for you. But if you want a great balance between energy, clarity and separation without losing soundstage depth and weight in the sound, I've been really pleasantly surprised by what the KT88 Select brings to the table, or brings to the amplifier. So if you're in the market for tubes, or a tube amp and then the tubes to go with it, there's never been a better time than now. There are more great choices than ever before, except maybe back in the 50s and 60s. There's thick, rich and smooth like the Mullard EL34s, or you can go for a slightly crisper and more resolving version of that sound with the Ray Tubes EL34 Select. You can go all out with the GEC KT66 for godlike mid-range, or you can go punchy, dynamic and in your face with Goldline or Black Treasure KT88s. Or you can strike a really lovely middle ground with a combination of energetic and dynamic and smooth and creamy and rich through the mids with the KT88 Select tube. The choices abound, and that's awesome. So if you want to pick up some Ray tubes for yourself, check out the link below for stockists in your local region. And for now, as always, I want to say a huge thanks to channel members, to channel Patreon members, and to those of you that leave super thanks on videos like this one. If you can't run any of these tubes, but you can run 6SN7 tubes, then you have to check out my review of the Ray Tubes 6SN7 Reserve. It's absolutely phenomenal. I've linked it up here, and I made that review before I ever knew that I was going to be stocking these, and it's actually one of the reasons why I decided to sell these tubes. So check out that one linked up here, but for now let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.